and we've been talking about what exactly transpired. What are people that were at the concert saying, posting, talking about? We have a whole picture of it on social media, and Robert Arnold is joining us live in the newsroom, tracking those social media posts.
Well, the social media posts that continue to come in throughout the morning are the same ones, similar in nature, the ones we've been seeing since very early this morning and since this event started, and that's just one of utter and complete chaos. So as these posts describe, you have this massive crowd that's there. Everybody's waiting for this concert to start, for the main concert to start, the main artist, Travis Scott, to come out. And so as it got closer to time for Travis Scott to come out, everybody started going closer and closer and closer to that main stage. So you have a lot of people on social media describing that they couldn't get to the front, so they were kind of off to the side, and you had metal barriers there. One young lady described that metal barrier was at her chest. So you have all of these people encroaching on the stage, kind of inching closer and closer and packing in tighter and tighter and tighter. And you had a lot of this pent-up energy waiting for this concert to start. And so a lot of people described that once they got into that crowd, they turned around. They weren't leaving. As like I said, one young lady described it as where your feet were planted were where they stayed. You were not moving. A colleague of mine, his son was there, said his son was at the front, and as they were closer to the front, they turned around. There was no way to get out at that point. And so then what happens, and you could see it on social media, you had everybody with their phones out. When Travis Scott came out, I mean, it was an incredible entrance. The pyrotechnics went off. You had the display, the crowd, just a massive release of energy. And so everybody starts surging forward at that point. And that's when you start hearing reports from some people that some people started getting trampled, some people started getting crushed, and they were screaming for help, but it was just mass chaos at the point. Now, the video that we're showing now, that was from earlier in the day, where you had dozens of people that toppled a security fence because they wanted to bypass a checkpoint. So you had some aggression earlier in the day. There were several people detained from this particular incident, but you couldn't get everybody. I was also speaking with somebody else that when you have a massive crowd like that, it is very difficult to plan for every single tiny contingency. And then when you have a crowd that tightly packed, it is very difficult to get either police officers or paramedics in there very quickly, because you have this confusion. The people in the back don't know that people in the front are getting crushed. People are screaming. People can't hear. There's questions about how quickly these artists were notified. We're seeing reports on social media that there were certain pauses in that initial performance, but it took a while for the performance itself to end. So how quickly were the artists notified that, hey, this is happening now? Because we do know a lot of times if artists are informed quickly, they can try to calm the crowd down and prevent further injury in this area. There was one famed incident involving Tejano singer Selena, where she was at a concert. She noticed people up front were starting to get crushed against the front of the stage, and they weren't able to get out. And so she worked to calm the crowd down. That prevented further injury. So they're going to work to find out how quickly Travis Scott and the other artists were all notified about exactly what was going on there. Some of the other artists were taking video in the crowd. You could see paramedics performing CPR. People were screaming for help. One young lady posted that she passed out, and she believes one of her friends was able to somehow get her body back to the back, and when she woke up, she had no idea what happened, just was lying there on the ground with a water bottle in her lap. And so there was a lot of this. You have what's called traumatic asphyxiation. When people start panicking, they start getting compressed in the area, and that would explain some of the trampling injuries that we're seeing. We're also checking into reports that the fire chief, that there may have been drugs involved with some of these cardiac arrest cases. None of that at this point has been settled. So that's going to be a lot to this investigation. You know, was it a mix of drugs? Was it trampling? How quickly were artists notified? How quickly did this escalate out of control? Because we've had similar sized crowds in the past at this Astroworld Festival, and we have not had nearly as serious an incident. Matter of fact, we were going through our records and we found out that there were some people injured in 2019, but minor. They were like knee injuries, nothing to this extent, where you have at least 8 people dead, several more injured, and they're still trying to go through. We've seen some posts from some parents, I haven't heard from my child. So there are still people out there looking for loved ones, and still a lot of information that is missing as to exactly how all of this transpired. We're going through that. We're trying to talk more with both the fire chief and the police chief. as well as talking to those who were there. And as we keep getting this new information, we will keep updating you both on air and on click2houston.com. Back to you guys.
Robert, before we let you go, I just want to go back to the description that you had made earlier when you talked about, this is just heart-wrenching, when you talked about the crowd being so intense that people were drowning in people. Once it got so packed and people were kind of just getting shuffled in and out, that description really stuck with me, and I'm sure it stuck with our viewers.
Oh yeah, that was a description from one young lady on Instagram. She posted that once it started, people started drowning, and she put a dash in other people. And I remember even saying, you know, let that sink in for a minute. I mean, there's just nothing you can do. I mean, the problem with this is it's a cascading effect. So everybody starts crushing forward. Well, that's not something you can just stop instantly. When people start getting hurt, the people behind them don't know they're being hurt. They can't see, they can't hear. So people start screaming, and then it just becomes mass chaos. And then I got a description from a colleague of mine who had a son there who said the police were then trying to usher people out as quickly as possible. And that was not a fast process either, because there was really nowhere to go quickly. And in fact, he said his son and his friends were closer to the front of the stage and didn't even realize there were any problem until they were leaving and they saw paramedics performing CPR on people. So that just goes to show you, when you have this massed crowd, not everybody knows what's going on, and it just leads to more chaos. And then when you have chaos, people start acting, you know, in irrational manners. And so it takes a long time to calm that type of a situation down once it started rolling.
I know that you typically do not ever have your investigative hat off. So I want to ask you now, right now, as you start to take a look at this, you've been watching what's been going on, where do you start? As an investigative unit, as an investigator, where do you start, you think you start, to try to figure out what happened with this?
Well, I mean, one of the things we start is we try to establish a timeline. Okay, so when were the first calls for help coming in? You know, when did you start hearing that, people are being trampled, people are passing out, CPR in progress? So you start with that timeline. Then you start looking at the number of people that were on site. Now, we've already heard that you had, I think, what was it, close to 500, a mix of HPD and security that were online. But then you ask about, okay, what about medical help? I'm trying to figure out that. How many paramedics were on scene? How many ambulances were on scene to handle a crowd of this size? We're still waiting to hear those answers as well. Now, once you're there, we're also waiting to hear from paramedics. You know, what type of symptoms were you seeing? We've heard some of these people, you know, were having to perform CPR. We had cardiac arrest, but what preceded that? Were they seeing other symptoms of potentially drug overdoses? Were there trauma injuries? We're trying to piece all of that together. And then, of course, we start finding out, okay, when did word get to the artists? When were they told that, hey, we've got a real problem on here, we need to stop our performance now, because the longer we keep performing, the energy is going to keep up in the crowd, and we're not going to get people to disperse quickly. So we're going to look at that. And then, of course, we'll go even further back. We want to know about the planning, you know, what emails, what kind of plans were put in place, what was discussed, what kind of contingencies were discussed. We're going to, one of the things that I'm going to ask about as well is if they had this type of event, like a barrier pit that's in front of the crowd, which is standard, which kind of is supposed to be able to help pluck people out who are being crushed in front and also get word to the artists faster. So how did that work? That barrier pit, was that there? How was that working? How was the communication in that area? And we'll look at contracts, what was called for, estimated crowd size, all of that to try and paint a complete picture.
On a lot of investigative work to be done. Thank you, Robert, for giving us a look into the mindset of the process that you'll start to do over the next several days to get to the bottom of this.
Yes.
Lots to get into.